All right, welcome back, everybody. Coming to you live, streaming from my house, Bio 153 online. So we continue with chapter 28. It's a fairly lengthy chapter. Last time we talked about the male reproductive system. And so today we're going to talk about the female reproductive system, learning about the anatomy and the physiology. So that's what our topic is about today. Okay, so our first slide here, we're taking a look at the internal genitalia and external genitalia. And so we're going to learn about the functions of these structures. So you can see here the internal genitalia is indicated in the red and the external genitalia is indicated in the green. And just like we looked at the gonads in the male, which of course were the testicles, here we're taking a look at the gonads of the female, which are the ovaries. So these are considered to be the female gametes, sex cells, and it's within the ovaries where two very critical hormones are produced for the female, estrogen and progesterone. So we'll be talking about those two quite a bit in here today. So estrogen and progesterone are produced in the ovaries. And so we'll be talking a lot more in detail very soon. Starting off with our focus looking at the internal reproductive organs genitalia, we start off with this slide looking at ligaments. And there's a lot of different ligaments that are found internally that provide additional protection and support to a lot of these internal genitalia. So we'll go through these together. We have first here, which is known as the ovarian ligament, which anchors the ovary. So that's our first one here. So the ovarian ligament. We can see that in the picture right here, ovarian ligament, which is right here. So I can get the pen here for you, and we can see that right there, the ovarian ligament and ovarian ligament. We also have what's known as the round ligament, which supports the uterus. So likewise in this diagram, we can see that here too. So here's our round ligament right there. We can also see here another critical ligament known as the suspensory ligament, which anchors the ovary in place. So another very important ligament for sure. And the one on the bottom here we have is the broad ligament. Broad because it's very vast, a very large sheath, which doesn't just support one particular organ, but many. So it can support the uterine tubes. That's just a fancy term for fallopian tubes. It provides support for the uterus and also the vagina. So here's the broad ligament here. From a pictorial perspective, if we trace it, it's this entire area right here, which is the broad ligament. Okay? So there's a variety of different ligaments here that ultimately are important for protection, support, anchoring of the internal genitalia in place in the female. So now we're going to start looking at these internal structures and learning the functions of them. So first, right here we have the ovary. Again, the female gamete, where the sex cells are. So typically women have 2 ovaries. And when the woman is going through ovulation, eventually the adult follicle will rupture, and that will lead to the expelling of the egg. The scientific term for the egg is known as the oocyte. Okay, so oocyte is just a fancy term for the egg, which is typically expelled on day 14 of ovulation. And it's carried through peristalsis, the movement of the oocyte. So the egg then will leave the ovary and make its way into a structure known as the fimbriae. The fimbriae. The fimbriae are finger-like projections that kind of hold on to the ovary and will be important for movement of the egg, the oocyte, eventually down the uterine tube or the fallopian tube. So the uterine tube ultimately is going to receive that oocyte, that egg, and slowly but surely then the oocyte will travel down the uterine tube. So we can trace that pathway. So here's the fimbriae again, those finger-like projections. Then the oocyte makes its way to the infundibulum, a term which is kind of referring to a stalk, just like you had an infundibulum in the brain. And then the oocyte continues to an area known as the ampulla. The ampulla. This is typically this area where fertilization occurs, is the ampulla, where the sperm will encounter the egg. So maybe the egg is right here, and you have a little sperm right here, and bam, fertilization right there. Typically that's where it occurs. Not all the time, but most times. So from here then, you have the oocyte that travels down the uterine tube, and eventually it can make its way to the isthmus. So that's a very narrowed area of the uterine tube. And the oocyte can travel into the uterus. And the top of this uterus is called the fundus. That's the superior part there. Now, of course, we're talking about a fertilized egg by now in many early stages of mitotic development, early on embryonic development. But sometimes there are situations where the egg is not fertilized in the ampulla. I mean, most of the time it is, but not all the time. So sometimes fertilization, where the sperm can encounter the egg, can be farther down the uterine tube or even in the top of the uterus. It's not always the ampulla, most of the time, however. And then we get into the uterus. So this entire structure here is referring to the uterus. So the uterus is where the implantation occurs of the fertilized egg. right into the innermost layer known as the endometrium. And ultimately then the fertilized egg will evolve into the embryo, fetus, and eventually baby. So hence the importance of many of these structures. But sometimes there's situations, however, where some women may experience what's known as an ectopic pregnancy. Maybe you've heard of this term before, or maybe not. So ectopic pregnancy. And we'll get the eraser here. There we go. So ectopic pregnancy. Got all my lovely handwriting, huh? So ectopic pregnancy, we're talking about where the egg will not go ahead and implant in the uterus. Instead, the oocyte, the egg, may decide to plant maybe up here in the uterine tube, or maybe even outside of that in tissue outside. So that can be a very dangerous situation. Obviously, this is not going to be a successful pregnancy. We're talking obviously early miscarriage here, and it can be very severe and health-wise for the woman, and it can lead to a lot of internal bleeding and very dangerous on the health of the woman. So sometimes that happens. Definitely increased chances of that happening. If the woman's smoking or alcohol, those types of things can definitely increase the probability of that. So very dangerous. And again, ectopic pregnancy is not a successful pregnancy. And again, this is where the oocyte egg does not embed in the uterus, but typically the fallopian tubes or uterine tubes. Okay? Moving on. Again, we discussed the uterus prior, and we can see the major regions of the uterus here. Again, this is the uterus right here in the middle here. So this is the uterus here. And we can take a look at the regions of the uterus. So the regions are the fundus. Fundus is the top of the uterus, superior portion. We look at regions. So right up here is the fundus. And this area here is the body. So this is the major part of the uterus for the region. And then the very narrowed area down here would be the isthmus, the narrowed inferior region. What we can also see on here is the wall layers of the uterus. So we take a look now at the wall layers. The innermost wall layer is the endometrium. Endo means internal. So this is where the implantation will occur of that fertilized egg, eventually embryo. So the innermost wall layer right here, the uterus. The middle wall layer is known as the myometrium. That's going to be the really thick middle layer here, right there. And very important when it comes to the pregnancy. This wall layer undergoes lots of the big contractions that occur during labor. So very important. And the outermost layer, most superficial of the uterus, is known as the perimetrium. The perimetrium. The next structure we're going to take a look at is the cervix. So the cervix, it's kind of a narrow necked structure which projects into the vagina. So in this image here, the cervix would be this structure right here. And then we also then, of course, have the vagina. And the vagina is very important. It's the birth canal for the newborn baby. It's also important during sex, during vaginal sex. The vagina is also, of course, being utilized during the woman's period, when you have the overall shedding that takes place, the menstrual shedding in that inner wall layer of the uterus. So many important functions of the vagina. And then there's also cervical glands which secrete mucus near the cervix, which blocks sperm entry up into the uterus, exception ovulation. So very important, of course, to know the functions of these various structures. All right, moving on, we're now going to focus in on the endometrium. And the endometrium, this innermost wall layer of the uterus, again, we're talking about wall layers of the uterus here. The endometrium is broken down into two stratum layers. So we have what's known as the stratum functionalis and the stratum bacillus. So the stratum functionalis is actually the layer that's actually broken down during the period, during the menstrual cycle. And this is in part because of the response to blood levels of ovarian hormones. So really talking about variation in the amount of estrogen progesterone, which plays a significant role here. So if I were to kind of circle this area for you, it would be right here. And then the stratum bacillus. The stratum bacillus assists and will form the new stratum functionalis layer and is unresponsive to ovarian hormones. So it's unresponsive to estrogen and progesterone. So this layer is not broken down during the menstrual cycle. It's maintained and will help to rebuild that stratum functionalis layer. Okay, so we have here the stratum functionalis right up here, the layer broken down during the period. And this layer here is the stratum bacillus, which is not broken down, unresponsive to estrogen and progesterone, and will help to rebuild the stratum functionalis layer. Now we're going to take a look at more of the external genitalia, so important to know the overall functions here. So at the top here, we have a structure known as the mons pubis. Right up here, this area typically is a fatty area covered with pubic hair. If we make our way down, the next structure we'll take a look at is the clitoris. And so the clitoris, there's actually a prebis to that. There's actually foreskin to the clitoris. And this structure is very similar to the penis, actually, because the penis had foreskin too, prebis. The clitoris contains erectile tissue, so this will also become erect during sex for the female, just like the penis becomes erect in the male during sex. And it's very sensitive to touch. It's a very sensitive structure. Continuing on with structures, we have what's known as the labia majora and the labia minora. These are skin folds surrounding the vagina. So the labia majora typically is hair covered and contains fatty skin folds, while the labia minora is the innermost layer here around the vagina and is hair-free for the skin folds. So here, we can see that here, the labia majora, and down here, the labia minora. Other additional structures to know, we have what's known as the greater vestibular gland. The greater vestibular gland. And the importance of this gland, the greater vestibular gland, is that it contains a lot of mucus. There's a bulb actually connected to it and will release mucus during sex. And during the sexual experience, there's a significant increase in release of mucus around the vicinity, around the vagina. And this is very important for actual lubrication of the penis during vaginal sex. So that's the importance of the greater vestibular gland, and it would be right here and right here, so very close to the opening of the actual vagina. Another important structure to know is what's known as the hymen. This is an incomplete partition, typically found in virgins. But during the first sexual encounter then that the woman experiences, the structure will rupture as the penis goes into the vagina. So that's typically what will happen. And here's the hymen right here. And sometimes it's not sex that actually ruptures the structure. Sometimes it can be sport related for the woman if she's playing a very physical contact sport like maybe football or soccer or rugby or something along those lines. Even a tampon sometimes can rupture the structure. We can see here if we go ahead and erase the drawings here. Again, this is the opening of the vagina here. So the vaginal orifice, referring to opening of the vagina. And then right here, this is the urethral orifice, where the woman will urinate. So very important to definitely know the overall functions of these structures. We're now going to take a look at the autonomic nervous system response in the female during the sexual encounter. So first we're going to look at what happens, the events involved that are controlled by the parasympathetic nervous system, okay? The parasympathetic nervous system. So during this first response, during the initial sexual encounter, the clitoris of the woman and the breast will become erect and engorged with blood. There also will be an increased lubrication of the vagina taking place as well. So both of these items here are controlled by the parasympathetic nervous system of the female. We now take a look at the sexual response taking place, events that are controlled by the sympathetic nervous system. So we look at the events involved with the sympathetic nervous system control. So when the woman reaches the overall climax during the sexual encounter and reaches orgasm, what will take place is a significant increase in rhythmic contractions of the vagina and also significant increased rhythmic contractions of the uterus during the climax or orgasm that takes place. The woman will also experience during the sexual encounter climax, you can see down here, increased heart rate and respiratory rate will go up as well. That would also be true with the male when he reaches orgasm for the increased heart rate and respiratory rate. And we can kind of see that here, definitely this last picture here showing that with the rhythmic contractions of the vagina and the uterus. And of course, the importance of this is to increase the chances of having progeny, of having children. All right, moving on now, we're going to take a look now at the mammary glands. And so the function of the mammary glands is lactation, milk production. So we look at the overall direction of milk flow that occurs in the female. So first, we start with number one, the granular alveoli. And this structure, the granular alveoli, is the site of milk production. So this is where the milk is produced in the female. Then the milk will travel to number two, the lactiferous ducts, to eventually the lactiferous sinuses. And the lactiferous sinus is where milk accumulates during the nursing process. So we can literally draw that out here. So the granular alveoli are in the brown here. And if we're just talking about one little area, we talk about the lobule-containing alveoli. So these structures here, all in the brown, for example, is the granular alveoli where milk is produced. Then ultimately milk travels down the lactiferous ducts here, these canals, to eventually right here is the lactiferous sinus, these bulbs. And then the milk will continue out. There's a little bit more of a part of the lactiferous duct before the milk is ejected out through the nipple. And so that is the direction that milk will travel. So important to know. All right, next we're going to take a look at the structure of the ovary. So down here, this is a picture, pretty large picture of the ovary here. And we take a look, there's two major regions to the ovary. There's the cortex and the medulla. The cortex is the outermost region, which is where the gametes are formed, the sex cells, referring to, of course, the egg. The medulla is more internal in the middle, which contains blood vessels and nerves. So here's the medulla, you can see right here, in contrast to the cortex out here. So medulla in here, cortex out here. And during the ovarian cycle, we have stages of follicles being formed. And ultimately, the follicle will contain an egg. So early on, you have a primitive stage of follicle development known as the primordial follicle. So primordial follicle. So very early on in the ovarian cycle. So here you can see that here, the primordial follicle's there. After that, they'll start to grow, and you'll have a primary follicle. So primary follicle. And then eventually that will grow into a secondary follicle. And then eventually a late secondary follicle. So again, you can see that here. Primary follicle, secondary follicle. So now we have that egg here. And even some cells surrounding it known as granulosa cells. And then even a late secondary follicle stage here. Before eventually you end up developing the adult follicle known as the Graphinian follicle. And that sets up the stage where this adult follicle starts to bulge from the side of the ovary, kind of preparing for ovulation to take place. So the focus here now, we continue on looking at this ovary and the adult follicle. Again, the fancy term for that is known as the Graphinian follicle. So again, down here, the adult follicle, Graphinian follicle. And there's several different structures that we find here. A big part of the Graphinian follicle is known as a structure known as the antrum, which is a fluid-filled cavity that you find internally in the adult follicle. So antrum. And like I mentioned, this adult follicle starts to bulge from the side of the ovary. And of course, in the middle is the egg, the oocyte. So then during ovulation, we get to a point where you get to day 14, where the adult follicle ruptures and the oocyte ends up being expelled. So here is that oocyte expelled, which will continue on then eventually to the fimbriae and down the uterine tube and so on and so forth. So what you're left with now is the ruptured follicle. And this develops into what's known as the corpus luteum. The corpus luteum. So the corpus luteum is the ruptured follicle after ovulation. And so it might look like perhaps a funky looking brain structure here. Perhaps. And the thing is about the structure, if the woman's pregnant, this structure will be maintained and will be critical early on in the pregnancy because a lot of estrogen and progesterone is produced here. But if the woman is not pregnant, then this structure will break down and will degrade. And so we can kind of see this here, the degrading here of the corpus luteum. So definitely important structures to know. All right, we have our first review session here, so time to find your eye clickers at home. And here's our first review question for today. Milk is produced in the blank in the mammary glands. So where's the milk produced? Where's the milk produced? All right, and the correct answer here is going to be choice letter B, the granular alveoli. Number 2 for review, fertilization usually will take place in the blank. So where did I mention that fertilization usually occurs? Where would that be? All right, and the correct answer here would be letter D, the ampulla. So the ampulla and the uterine tube. All right, number 3. Which of the following processes are controlled by the sympathetic nervous system? Which of the following processes are controlled by the sympathetic nervous system in the female? Okay, and the correct answer here, of course, the clue is sympathetic nervous system. So your correct answer here should be choice letter B, rhythmic contractions of the vagina, right? So it's not going to be erection of the clitoris or increased lubrication of the vagina because those are taking place during the parasympathetic nervous system. Okay, so moving on, now our focus is really focusing in on the physiology of the female. So we look at a process known as oogenesis. Oogenesis, and this is referring to the production of the sex cells, the gametes. So referring to the eggs. Approximately at birth, a female will have 7 million of these eggs. And by the time she gets to puberty, the woman is down to approximately 300,000 of these eggs. And from the point of puberty to menopause, approximately about less than 500 of these oocytes are released. And again, puberty starts around, it really varies, but it can sometimes start at 11, 12, 13, 14 years old. And menopause varies. Again, a lot of it's based off of genetics. So for some women, menopause could start late 40s, early 50s, mid 50s. Just a lot of variation there, really. And so this picture here is ultimately showing again, we mentioned follicle development already, so we kind of went through that already. The primordial follicle stage here, going to the adult follicle here, rupturing of the follicle, corpus luteum, etc. And this is showing the actual eggs here, mitotic events. So in some ways, this is somewhat similar when we looked at spermatogenesis. You start with the stem cell, oogonium here, and eventually the growth here. And here we can see from actual puberty to menopause, where you end up with 4 daughter cells at the end. And then the ovum here occurs here if sperm penetrate actually takes place. Okay, so now really focusing in on the ovarian cycle. One thing to note when we look at the woman's period is that the ovarian cycle and the menstrual cycle occur simultaneously at the same time, just different locations. With the ovarian cycle, this is taking place in the ovaries, while the menstrual cycle is taking place in the uterus. So, 2 main phases of the ovarian cycle: the follicular phase and the luteal phase. The follicular phase is referring to the time frame of the follicle growth, which is usually days 1 through 14, and then the adult follicle ruptures at ovulation, day 14. The second half of this process is known as the luteal phase, referring to corpus luteum activity, which would be days 14 through 28. And again, this is all about, the corpus luteum being maintained if the woman's pregnant with high amounts of estrogen and progesterone early on in the pregnancy. And again, if she isn't pregnant, the structure breaks down. So a great question to ask yourselves is, well, what type of activities would alter the ovarian cycle or the menstrual cycle? Is the period always going to be a 28-day process? And of course, the answer here should be, hopefully for everybody here, no. So there's a lot of different things that can alter the timing of the period, of the ovarian cycle, menstrual cycle. A lot of things can play a role here. Definitely the woman's diet can play a role. Her nutrition can play a big role. Sometimes stress. She might miss her period, might come at a different time. Obviously, if she's pregnant, sometimes birth control can alter the time frame of the period. So a lot of different things. And some women, if their daily routine is similar to other women they're close friends with, they live together, sometimes they may have their periods together. So a lot of variation there, but definitely the stress of a woman, her nutrition, birth control, things like that can really alter the period. Okay. So some of these items we've already discussed a little bit, like the Graafidian follicle being a fancy term for the adult follicle. But the big thing we're going to get out of this slide is looking at all the structures that make up the Graafidian follicle. So in the middle is the egg. So here we have the secondary oocyte. Secondary because, of course, both ovaries are ovulating and expelling of an egg. So as a primary, there's a secondary. So in this image here, this is the egg right here. And then surrounding the egg, we have a structure known as the zona pellucida. So zona pellucida. So the zona pellucida, it's a glycoprotein-rich substance and forms a very thick, transparent extracellular layer of protection around the egg. You also have a structure known as the corona radiata. So the corona radiata is a capsule that contains granulosa cells, surrounds the oocyte. So we can see that here. Again, this area here is the zona pellucida, and this area here is the corona radiata. And then the antrum is the fluid-filled cavity in the gray here. So all this area here is the antrum. Okay, the antrum. Antrum. And then to the outside of the adult follicle are additional granulosa cells and thecal cells. So this area right back here contains those granulosa cells and thecal cells. So very important, these cells, the thecal cells, and likewise granulosa cells, critical for production of estrogen here. Okay, the corpus luteum. We've mentioned this structure before. This is going to be that ruptured follicle, and it almost looks like a funky looking brain. So we can kind of see that right here. Corpus luteum, the ruptured follicle. And this structure contains two very important types of cells here, granulosa cells and the thecal cells. And again, a large area production for progesterone and estrogen in the woman. Again, we've mentioned before, if the woman isn't pregnant, the corpus luteum will degrade in about a week and a half. However, if she is pregnant, the corpus luteum will be maintained and will produce high levels of estrogen and progesterone. This is very important early on in the first trimester before the placenta forms and takes over the functionality. So now we're going to look at the physiology involved with regulation of the ovarian process. So looking at the ovarian cycle, the physiology involved. So first, the women here, the woman will go ahead and puberty will kind of start. It takes approximately around 4 years for the menstrual period to be on a more regular schedule. And these first initial steps are very similar to what we saw with the male physiology when he was going through puberty up in the brain. So these names of these hormones are going to look really familiar to what we've seen before. So early on, gonadotropin releasing hormone, GnRH, produced up in the hypothalamus of the brain. So up here again, hypothalamus of the brain. And this hormone then, GnRH, will travel down to the pituitary gland. And so here we have this pituitary gland right here. So GnRH will stimulate the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland to go ahead and secrete two very important hormones, FSH and LH. So the follicle stimulating hormone and the luteinizing hormone. And both of these hormones then will leave the pituitary gland, the anterior lobe, and will travel through the bloodstream eventually to the woman's ovaries. Once they get there, FSH will go ahead and interact with the follicles in the ovarian cycle and will interact with the granulosa cells and really will stimulate that estrogen production. While the luteinizing hormone, LH, will interact with the thecal cells and will be a big role player with androgen production. And likewise estrogen. But not just estrogen, it can also play a big role with production of progesterone too. We now take a look at the negative feedback mechanism process here. So in the situation where maybe estrogen levels are being produced at a very high rate, maybe higher than what is needed, what will happen is a new hormone, inhibin, produced in the granulosa cells will be released, which of course is in the follicle and the ovary. And so what can happen then is this hormone inhibin, referring to inhibiting, will leave the granulosa cells in the follicle, inhibin, and will ultimately travel up to the brain and temporarily will inhibit production of the FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, inhibit that temporarily, and likewise can do the same with LH and gonadotropin releasing hormone. And by doing so then, that allows for estrogen to get back to a normal level of homeostasis, as estrogen already in the follicle will go on to the mature follicle. Okay, now we're going to take a look at the positive feedback mechanism. And looking at the positive feedback mechanism, we look at a point during the ovarian cycle where estrogen levels actually spike. And this significant increase in estrogen will actually play a very significant role with triggering the brain, the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland, and the hypothalamus to go ahead, and this leads to eventually a significant amount of production of LH. This is known as the LH surge. Okay? So a large amount of estrogen will play a role, kind of interacts the hypothalamus, because this is where gonadotropin releasing hormone is produced. And that, of course, goes down to the pituitary gland anterior lobe, where the LH is produced. And hence, at this point, you'll have a lot of LH which is produced. And this is known as the LH surge. What this hormone will do, LH, is it actually will interact with the adult follicle and plays a big role with the adult follicle rupturing during ovulation, day 14, where the egg is actually going to be expelled and released. A lot of this is due because of the LH surge. This is all triggered from a large amount of estrogen production. So the LH, again, interacts with the adult follicle, leads to the rupturing of the adult follicle and the expelling of the egg. And of course, this is taking place during ovulation, day 14. After that, the egg is expelled. What we're left with again is the corpus luteum, that ruptured follicle. This is a big location for production again of estrogen and progesterone. And again, this structure will be maintained if the woman is pregnant. If she's not pregnant, then the corpus luteum will degrade. So large amounts of progesterone, estrogen in the case of the pregnancy. But again, if she's not, the structure will break down. So what will happen then is inhibin can be released again, that hormone, and can go up to the brain. And this will lead to inhibiting LH, FSH, and GnRH production. By doing so, the levels of estrogen, progesterone go down. Okay, the other very critical cycle to know, we've spent a lot of time today looking at the ovarian cycle, but now we're going to take a look at another cycle that occurs at the same time, which is known as the menstrual cycle, or the uterine cycle. This takes place in the uterus. There are three major phases of the menstrual cycle. The first phase is known as the menstrual phase, so pretty much the same name, and this is occurring early on in the cycle, days 1 through 5. During this time frame, ovarian hormone levels are low, referring to estrogen and progesterone. You'll have a slight increase in GnRH, and ultimately the endometrium will be shed. So that stratum functionalis layer will be broken down, and the tissues will go out through the vagina, hence the menstrual flow. The second phase of the menstrual cycle is known as the proliferative phase. The proliferative phase. This is going to be days 6 through 14. During this time frame, estrogen levels increase significantly. We start to rebuild the endometrium, and glands and blood vessels start to increase in number. And the final phase we can see down here, this is known as the overall secretory phase. This happens after ovulation, days 15 through 28. You have a significant increase in progesterone here. The endometrium will be completely rebuilt, and a lot of nutrients will be here now. So we're setting up a perfect time frame for the endometrium to go ahead and accept the blastocyst. So the fertilized egg, and of course a lot of mitotic division leads to what's known as a blastocyst, which we'll get into a little later. We're now going to take a look at a series of graphs. So this graph here is ultimately showing during ovulation day 14 the huge increase, significant increase in LH, referring to the LH surge, because I remember I mentioned that this hormone directly interacts with the adult follicle, leading to that follicle rupturing and expelling of the egg. This picture here, again, review of the ovarian cycle. We can see here again the follicular phase, the first half of the cycle, okay, where the follicle is developing. Ovulation day 14 here, where the egg expels. And then the second half here, the luteal phase, where the follicle has ruptured. You're left with the corpus luteum here. And again, the structure will degrade if the woman isn't pregnant. This graph here is showing, again, the three major phases of the menstrual cycle. So first we have the menstrual phase. So estrogen and progesterone levels are low here. So the estrogen is indicated by the orange line. Progesterone is indicated by the green line. Proliferative phase is the second phase here. This is where we have a big increase in estrogen production. And then the last phase, secretory phase, is where progesterone really takes off. This graph here, we get an idea of the thickness of the stratum functionalis layer of the endometrium. So first, the menstrual phase, the layer, most of it, the stratum functionalis layer is broken down and shedded, going out through the vagina. The second phase, again, is proliferative, where we are now rebuilding that stratum functionalis layer. So we can kind of see that here. It's starting to build up. And then the last phase, again, is that secretory phase. And so at this point, we're going to completely rebuild the endometrium here. And now we're ultimately ready for receiving of the blastocyst, implantation of the blastocyst, which will become the embryo. We're now going to take a look at the critical functions of estrogen. So estrogen, such an important hormone in the female. So estrogen, or estrogens, because there's actually a variety of derivatives of estrogen. Estrogen is important for oogenesis, so production of the eggs and follicle growth. It also has some important characteristics of anabolic effects, especially for taking up sodium in the kidneys of the woman. It helps to facilitate calcium uptake too, which is really important. So hence, critical that the woman has plenty of calcium in her diet, because this can become more difficult after menopause. And you don't want to end up with osteoporosis. Estrogen is also important in the female for production of her secondary sex characteristics, the growth of her breast, the increased deposit of fat around the hips and breast, which is important for birthing a child, and widening of the pelvis, which is very critical too, of course, for overall birth of the child. So all very important characteristics of estrogen. You may also be asking yourselves, well, where is estrogen produced? Remember we mentioned in the ovaries, and within the ovary, again, that's going to be the corpus luteum, right? We mentioned that was a really important structure. So corpus luteum. And of course, estrogen is also produced in the follicles, the developing follicles. And then you can see we have a question down here too. Well, what would happen if estrogen levels are low in the female? Because sometimes there's abnormalities that occur. Well, if that's the case, if estrogen levels are low in a female, the female might have more of possible male characteristics. All right, now taking a look at the other very critical hormone in the woman, progesterone. And the production location of progesterone, we go back to focusing again on the ovary. And within the ovary, then, the corpus luteum. The corpus luteum. So progesterone is really a critical hormone in the female. It will work with estrogen to regulate the menstrual cycle. It also plays important metabolic effects in the female, such as body temperature, increased body temperature, so body temperature regulation. And it's very important during the pregnancy too. So progesterone will be critical. It will inhibit uterine motility. So what we're talking about here is that progesterone plays a big role in trying to prevent a spontaneous abortion from happening. So it tries to play a big role in inhibiting a miscarriage from taking place, okay? So preventing a spontaneous abortion from taking place, kind of quieting that uterus. So hopefully the child will go through the 8-9 month process during the pregnancy. And progesterone also will prepare the breast for lactation and growth. So some very important functions that progesterone does here. Okay, so we have a couple more review questions to look at. So time to find your iClickers as we'll once again review. So review question number 4. Ovulation occurs on what day of the ovarian cycle? So what day was that? All right, and the correct answer here would be choice letter B, day 14 would be the correct answer. Number 5, during the ovarian cycle, the hormone blank is secreted in high amounts. Because of this leads to the mature follicle rupturing and expelling of the secondary oocyte. So what hormone was that interacted with the adult follicle, leading to the rupturing of that follicle? And the correct answer here would be choice letter D, the LH. Remember the LH surge? So LH surge, and significant elevation in LH, that's the hormone that interacts with the adult follicle, leading to the overall egg being expelled. Number 6, during the menstrual cycle, the endometrium is fully rebuilt, completely rebuilt, along with enrichment of blood and granular secretion of nutrients during this phase of the menstrual cycle. So what would be the correct answer here? What would be the correct answer here? All right, and the correct answer here would be choice letter C. So letter C is the correct answer here, the secretory phase. All right. Well, I hope you enjoyed today's lecture, and we'll see you again soon. So have a wonderful day.